This is the I Read Comic Books podcast, and I am your host for this week's episode, Paul Jasley, filling in for Mike Rapin. But of course, it's not a task that one person alone can do. I'm here with two fantastical woodland creatures from New England, Nick White.
Hey.
And Kait Lamphere.
Hello.
Thank you for joining me today. We are doing a special sort of Christmas holiday seasonally appropriate episode here. We were trying to think of a book that maybe wasn't specifically about Christmas, but maybe took place around Christmas time. And we decided to read Friday. This is a series, a collection of volumes written by Ed Brubaker with art by Marcos Martin and colors by Munsta Vicente. Third volume of this series just came out this past July, I believe, but it's been going on for about 5 years, being published on the Panel Syndicate website with hardcover or physical collections being published by Image Comics. Full disclosure, we'll be talking about the series as a whole. There will be spoilers, so if you don't want it spoiled, put this episode under the Christmas tree, come back after Christmas. I'll be ready for you. That being said, the sort of main plot of this book, it draws inspiration from Encyclopedia Brown, sort of like the 70s kid detective type genre. The main character that the book is named after, Friday Fitzhugh, comes home for Christmas from college, and she and her best friend and fellow teenage investigator Lancelot Jones haven't spoken much since she left. He immediately pulls her into an investigation, but the vibes between them are off. That night, there's a fire at their treehouse headquarters, and Friday finds him there at the treehouse, dead. She also sees a mysterious figure and gets knocked out from behind. That's the sort of basic plot of volume one. And maybe we can kind of like take a pause and talk about our initial impressions of that first volume, because I'm a huge Ed Brubaker fan. I love Marcos Martin. And this book somehow exceeded my expectations, at least that first volume of both of these creators. Nick, I kind of want to throw it to you because you read this book for the first time today for the episode. What was your initial impression of Friday from your first read?
Yeah. I read it today because, I guess this is just why I need to just thoroughly vet everything into the ground. But a while back, I wrote down, Image Comics. Okay, it's probably on CU or it's probably available, and I'll just read it then. And then today I was like, it's a Panel Syndicate book. I'm fucked. Or so I thought. But it turns out they do digital. I didn't know that. And yeah, I just read it earlier today, even though I will probably sound like the person who literally read it weeks and months ago. And
Sure.
I'm glad that we're discussing volume one first, because that's the part I probably understand. Honestly, I really like how this book begins, because in my mind, it basically goes, hey, do you remember Encyclopedia Brown? Which Paul and I remember because we're dinosaurs, and maybe everyone else. For those who don't know what we're talking about, Encyclopedia Brown was this know-it-all moron who his dad was a cop, and basically his dad wanted to not have to spend time with his son, so he was like, hey, why don't you go around solving crimes in our city? And by crimes, I mean like someone steals someone else's teddy bear or something. I don't fucking remember. It was basically on that level of gravity.
A lot of missing cats, I remember. It's like around.
Yeah, I'm sure his dad was like going around and just hiding shit just so he wouldn't have to deal with his son. That's the book we need. And so he basically does all these things, and he solves the case, and obviously like these books were very popular in the 70s and 80s, and ended up being like a live action TV show on HBO and other stuff, and it was a pretty big deal. I remember reading these books growing up. Sort of the big little, was it big or was it little, Nick? It was a pretty big twist, was that you were empowered to solve the mystery alongside Encyclopedia Brown. And then at the back of the book, if I remember this correctly, maybe this was a different series, there would be pages at the back of the book that would be that would be upside down, so you wouldn't accidentally spoil it. And you would go to the back of the book and it would explain what happened and who did it, because I never had a snowball's chance in hell of figuring it out on my own.
Right. Yeah.
So, and these were really just a revival in some ways of the Hardy Boys, for those of us who want to go back even a few more
further,
decades, or Nancy Drew, of course.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because Brubaker's channeling those vibes. But again, like most of the other Ed Brubaker stuff I've read is the more grounded adult version of it with criminal, reckless, and here we're getting, I don't want to say this is a young adult. It has the vibe of a young adult book, but there is a lot of
Yeah.
cursing and smoking in it. So it might not actually fit that. Um,
Yeah,
but it has
that's
that vibe,
true.
it has that same feel. And there is something about teenage detectives, even I guess, Friday is in college, so late teens, but there's something about the way that the book positions her friend Lancelot Jones he is a version of Encyclopedia Brown in this first volume. He's a nosy, know-it-all kid,
Yeah.
smarter than he lets on, all that stuff. So it's
And
basically
he'll tell
channeling
you
that.
it. Yeah.
Yeah,
He'll
and
proud I think he
it does
proudly proclaims that right out of the gate. I am the
for
smartest
sure.
boy in this town or whatever.
Yeah, and again, I think it's interesting because it does not only channel that vibe, it channels that time. Like it does. I don't know if the book is specifically states when it takes place, but it does have.
73.
Okay, 73. There you go. I was wrong. 73.
They tip you off one when she
Mhm.
goes to prom. The prom banner says 73.
Oh,
I'm glad you and I, Paul,
yes.
both fixate on these stupid little things, but yeah, the banner says 73, and then the movie theater, what do they call that thing out front?
Oh, the
Where
marquee.
yeah, the marquee
Yeah.
is it's a Roger Moore Bond movie, and
That
you
makes
can of
sense. Okay.
course look
Yeah.
it up, and there you go. So
Yeah.
yeah, which after I saw that I was like, yeah, this feels more 70s. The color palette, the cars feel more
Mhm.
70s than 80s. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. It does
So
channel that vibe quite a bit. Kate, what's your first impression about this book? How did you find it, and what did you think about the first volume?
I think I originally read this because you suggested it like a year and a half ago.
Sure. Okay.
So I have read this before, and then this was a reread, and I think I got a lot out of this by rereading it
Hmm.
and being able to take like a second look at things, kind of knowing I didn't quite
yeah,
remember everything that happened, but being able to like follow it from the beginning, knowing that there are so many twists in the story was really I don't know, it gave me more enjoyment of the story. But I
Sure.
remember the first time I read this, I spent a lot of time looking at the character design in particular.
yeah,
Hmm. Hmm.
yes,
Like Friday has this like long neck and then like this really short face, and I'm like, I don't know if I've ever seen a character designed like this, but it wasn't like a caricature,
yeah.
like
Right.
this was still like a person. She was a believable kid in a small town.
Hmm.
So I did enjoy the art
The
in
character
that way as well.
design reminded me a lot of Ian Bertram. Um,
Mm. Hmm.
who's done a bunch of things, but I usually think of House of Penance, the graphic
Hmm.
novel with Peter Tomasi about the Winchester House.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, definitely character design feels a bunch like Ian Bertram, and
Yeah. It's a simple. I mean, Marcos Martin does. It has a deceptively simple line style. Like all the lines are very like light and kind of like fluid. You know what I mean? And it looks very simple. But then like things like the design choices for especially Friday, like you were saying, like long neck, short face, almost like a caricature, but still like a believable. It doesn't look like exaggerated, but clearly is. It looks like an awkward teenage girl. Honestly, it's like that. The channels that vibe. And then like though, but then you look at the backgrounds, like in the city square when they're in the city is drawn so well, and you get such a great sense of place. It feels like
yes,
a real city. Like a real, and it does seem to channel a very specific vibe of the Eastern Seaboard, New England, small town. It's a really remarkable way that I think Martine makes it feel realistic and weirdly unreal at the same time, especially in the later volumes when it gets a little wilder. Like it does a good job balancing the realism with the sort of more fantastical elements of the story.
Yeah, volume one, it definitely feels grounded in the real world. Like
Hmm.
this is like more of a standard noir book, I guess,
Yeah.
semi-modern, kind of dark detective story. Like nothing really
Hmm.
goes off the rails in volume one.
That's true. Yeah. Yeah. But I like there's also that sense of like channeling what it's like to be a teenager or a young adult coming back from college for the first time. Like that first opening pages of volume one when it's Friday doing the dialogue, like she's basically the narrator of the book, and she's talking about like coming back home, being uncomfortable. It might be awkward, meeting up with Lancelot because he's a couple years younger than she is. You know, they kind of lost touch. You know, I think a lot of people had that experience, especially back in the 70s when you couldn't stay in touch with your family as easily as you can now. Like when you left for college, that was a big move. You know what I mean? So like the sense of coming back, it did remind me of, I don't know if anyone's ever seen the movie The Ice Storm, the Ang Lee movie from the late 90s. It's set in New England. It's about a teenager coming back. It's Tobey Maguire is a teenager coming back from college for the first time for his Christmas vacation. It channeled that vibe of that movie, especially the first volume, very hard. And I love that movie. And it is set in the same time period. So I guess if you want a companion piece, very different vibe overall, but at least the first volume, The Ice Storm by Ang Lee, that's definitely a movie to watch if you want this kind of vibe from a story. Anyway, a little tangent there, but I think you're right. I think the story is more grounded. And by the way the first book ends, I was fully invested and I was maybe not ready for volume 2 to go where it went, but I kind of like the sense that Brubaker wasn't relying on the sort of tropes maybe that he's known for in his other work. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. I think I was also in a tricky situation as I started reading volume 2 and getting into it, where I didn't know whether to be surprised and happy that I wasn't able to sort of predict the trajectory or the tone of this book, or
Mhm.
also just kind of like, this isn't what I wanted. Um this isn't what I wanted this to be. So like, which,
Mhm.
I don't know. I was definitely of both minds, especially because I felt volume 1 was already in the same way that Criminal and Brubaker's other works like to tease out and kind of riff on different noir elements. Like I felt this
Yeah.
book, especially volume 1, was really riffing on, I mean, in a to just pose it as a question, like, hey, isn't Encyclopedia Brown just fucking weird if you stop and think about it? Like, if you really stop and think about it, like
Yeah.
this kid, he has his own little clubhouse and he solves mysteries, and like he
Mhm.
basically bosses around the cops and like is like,
Mhm.
oh yeah, this is the guy to arrest or whatever, and the cops just
Yeah.
go along with it, or even crazy, crazier, like when the cops have a problem, like they turn to like this 8-year-old or whatever. Isn't that kind of messed up? Like this book really sort of just plays with that, and it's like,
Mhm.
isn't that bizarre? And like, isn't it weird that like when you were a kid you read these books, and you're a kid, right?
Mhm.
So like
Yeah.
you're a kid reading a book where the protagonist is a kid, and I think in your mind you're like, yes, this all makes sense. All of this makes perfect sense. There's a real logic to this. And now I'm older and I'm like, what? Who why would anyone
There's
listen to
the
him? Why would anyone listen to him? You
there's
know?
the sheriff in this
Well,
volume
he's
who,
exactly the same. Like he gets pushed around like
yeah,
encyclopedia,
but
not
he
so,
does like at one point he does recognize that, and I think
yeah.
that that fact, like, that's used by who ends up being like the bad guy of the volume, which
Right.
is the detective. I think that, no, is that what happened in volume 2? I'm already getting confused,
I
but
think
Yeah, I think
anyway,
yeah.
that's in volume 1, and
Mm.
that sort of
Mhm.
gets at something I also think when, Paul, not to steal your thunder here, you can get
Mhm.
into this more, but Paul put some stuff in the notes about comparing this with Twin Peaks, which definitely the comparison is there, and Twin Peaks has also got this sort of issue where it exists within a bubble, and us looking in on it go, well, gosh, these are some weird people in this weird place doing some weird stuff, what's going on?
Mhm.
But we can't share that with them. We're just observing this. But both of these experiences have these outsider characters. In the case of Twin Peaks, it's Agent Dale Cooper, and in the
Mhm.
case of this book, it's not really an outsider, right? It's Friday technically returning, right? But she's
Mhm.
gotten out of this bubble, and now she's coming back to this place, and
Yeah.
sort of going, well, geez, this is kind of weird. But I'm also like drawn into it, and I'm caught up into it, and so I'm not
Yeah.
totally independent of it. And I think Agent Cooper is the same, where I'm an outsider and this is bizarre, but I'm also inextricably intertwined in this now.
Yeah, I think that's what makes Friday a really good protagonist, like point of view character, is because she is like a little bit apart from the happenings of the
Right.
town now.
Yeah.
But she's also gonna like follow, the evidence and follow the mystery, which is
Yep.
exactly what we want her to do as readers.
She's like slightly removed, but she's not removed enough to be like, I'm moving away for good. This is messed up shit.
It's interesting because she comes back and she has that sort of air of like, oh, I've been to the big city, I've been to college, and she's a little above everything. It's very cynical, but very quickly she's recognizes, oh, this is the way this town operates. Like it doesn't always make sense. And like as I was saying earlier, I like the way that Martine's artwork, it feels like a real place, but there's always something uneasy about it. They can never, what I mean? And it's just like, as you get deeper into it in volumes 2 and 3, there's a kind of an explanation. Like there is a force, a magic happening around this town that does change it. And maybe the people there don't see it that way because it's always been that way. You know what I mean? So us as outsiders, it does feel uneasy, but there's an internal logic to what's going on there. So, I think there's something to that. So her being the quote unquote outsider and yet willing to roll with the punches and being like, you know what, this doesn't make sense, but that's what happens here. That's just being in this town. So
right.
I like that vibe. So very quickly, let's talk about volume 2 then. So volume 2 or book 2, On a Cold Winter's Night. After a week of mourning the loss of or the death of Lancelot Jones, Friday investigates his death. The detective on the case turns into a monster and she kills it with fire. She then uncovers a local rich cult and unravels more mystery of the White Lady, who's kind of the antagonist of the story. Friday finds clues Lance left behind and a time machine watch, and she goes back to the night Lance died. Again, the shift in, I don't want to say a shift in tone, but a shift in direction between volume 1 and volume 2, at first glance feels like a super weird left turn, but again, I like that Brubaker did this because I'm such a fan of his grounded, grittier work. Seeing him play with a new color palette, quote unquote, or, to use a metaphor, was really fascinating to see him like, you know what, I can do a young adult novel. There's going to be cursing and smoking. And then, you know what, there's going to be magic and time travel too. Like, why not? And it's really fun as a fan of his work to see that. It doesn't always land, but I like to see him push himself and try something different,
Yeah, I mean this totally went outside of the comfort zone and certainly the on a basic level just the usual genres that we see Brubaker play with, which really just does not. And I mean, I'm trying to rack my brain, but it's typically very crime noir or something adjacent.
Yeah, the closest thing I can think of is Fatale, which does involve like black magic and satanic cults and stuff. But even that doesn't feel it still feels more grounded than this does at times. I don't recall there being time travel and anything else he's done other than, his Captain America work. That's a whole other conversation, but
yeah. And I mean, gosh, I'd have to revisit that. But I was like, I think Fatale also feels like it took a while to sort of unveil that other side of it, if you want to put it that way. So which it works for Brubaker. People who have read Brubaker in the past are almost always going to be shocked or surprised when these things happen because, like, for better or worse, he's really just set a baseline for where you expect his work to drop. So yeah, it definitely it gets an A for ambition, but it also feels like it tries to bite off more than it can chew, and maybe didn't have enough runway to see it all through. It feels either that there's too much stuff and it doesn't totally stick the landing because it's trying to address too many things. Yeah, I mean, it felt that way to me. Like it felt compacted.
I feel like this series, like I know that like volume 1 was like a noir story and volume 2 is suddenly like an occult story, I suppose. But I do feel like, considering that this was broken up into 3 distinct volumes, and at least the way that I could get it from the library was still in 3 distinct volumes, even
Mm,
though they're fairly short and they could be
Mhm.
collected as like one book.
yeah.
Like, they're
Mhm.
still available in that specific format, which I think is intentional because the pacing of the story is broken up into 3 very distinct acts where like
Yeah.
almost the genre of the book
Yes.
changes.
Mhm.
100%.
Um,
Mhm.
100%.
and like, considering that, I think that within the 3 volume act situation, I think it is a really well paced book, even though it does, like, once it starts, it doesn't end until the last page of volume 3. Like, you almost have to have it all in front of you, because
Mhm. Mhm.
I originally read it getting one book at a time out of the library, and I was like, this is unacceptable.
Fair, fair. Yeah, I mean, it's a dense story, but that does make sense. I never thought about it that way, but the 3 volumes do have very different feels and almost looks. Like the first volume is largely takes place outside. There's a winter storm. There's something sort of moody about the artwork. Volume 2, you get a bit more like, she's doing detective work at the library. She's like inside. It's a bit different kind of look and tone. Volume 3 gets very fantastical at the end, and like the artwork and coloring especially changes quite a bit over the 3 volumes. So it does also make it feel different volume to volume. Um, Kate, I do want to just take a brief aside here and ask, Nick and I have been talking about our uh, histories or experiences with Ed Brubaker. How much other Brubaker stuff have you read before going into
I've read
this?
a decent amount,
Okay.
because I mean, I know that you are a fan, so
Mhm.
I've kind of been following his work. I'm trying to remember what it is that I read as well. It was mostly this.
Okay. Sure. Sure.
But I read Pulp. That was really
Oh
good. That
yeah.
was a Western though. That was totally
Hmm.
different.
Yeah.
Um, Kill or Be Killed. I remember enjoying that
Yes.
one, but again, very different.
Hmm.
I don't remember liking Fattel all that well. I don't think I read past volume 1.
Well, Killer Be Killed, it's interesting you bring that up because Killer Be Killed also had that, started as a very grounded crime noir book, which
Hmm.
also took a similar kind of minor spoilers for like a 10-year-old book, but
Yeah.
also
Yeah.
took an interesting, weird twist.
Hmm. That's true. I get, yeah. I
I,
mean, maybe that's on me. Maybe I'm just the one's like, oh, Brubaker only does crime books. And then as we're talking about, I'm like, no, he does have a lot of range. He does have a willingness to kind of try different tropes and follow stories where they lead him rather than trying to fit, a stock format, you know. So maybe, yeah, maybe I'm selling Ed short. Sorry, Ed, friend of the show, Ed
yeah,
Brubaker. Again, you're more varied than maybe give you credit for. No, I think that's something that I get so used to. I think part of it too is so much of his work is done with Sean Phillips that when you
yes.
see him working with a different artist, it does feel radically different because Sean Phillips' artwork
Yeah.
and Marcos Martin are very different artists. But I couldn't imagine anyone else doing this story other than Marcos Martin.
Yeah.
Um, I do want to say, in terms of the style, especially you get more of it in volume 2 because a lot more things take place inside buildings and stuff, and people aren't just in winter coats all the time. I love the way Marcos Martin draws clothes. And like, I feel like drawing clothes is something that isn't always easy for artists to do, to have like a sense of fashion and style. And because Martin is channeling a very specific fashion moment in the early 70s, it looks amazing. The sweaters that Friday wears are so cool looking. And like her like slightly flared, not quite bell bottoms, but almost bell bottom kind of jeans that she's wearing. It really does give you that sense of time, and the way people are dressed. Everyone's hair's these like weird earth tones and the kind of like ugly shoes that they're wearing. Like it's such a little minor detail, but it actually sells the gimmick of the book really well for me. I really like the way he draws clothes, which not always something I notice when I read comics, but I made a note of that when I was rereading this stuff. I was like, man, everyone looks not fashionable, but they look like these are off the rack in 1973. You know what I mean? Anyway,
Yeah.
that's my fashion comment for this. Maybe no one else noticed that. Um,
Yeah, no, I did notice that the style, like especially for Friday, between the flashbacks and even the flash forward that we see at the very end of the series, are
mhm,
all like her style does change, and it's not just due to like the change in the time period, but like you can see that she's figuring out how she wants to dress and like what is going to serve her the best for this kind of work versus like coming back from college.
Okay. Yeah. She's back in her own neighborhood, back in her own, comfortable surroundings, I guess. So then we get to volume 3, and we talked about how much the series had changed at that point. And it's funny, when I went to read volume 3 this week for the episode, I had forgotten some of the details, and the biggest detail I'd forgotten was the time travel. So, which is a major part of volume 3. So in volume 3, Friday discovers that the White Lady is the queen of the Fae. The rich cult are under her control, and she's trying to get revenge for the murder of her husband by the town people centuries ago. Friday goes to the treehouse headquarters and witnesses Lance kill his evil doppelganger with fire, which is the body she discovered previously in volume 1. Lance has been Fae all along, but his late magical mother released him from the White Lady's hold. Together, Lance and Friday find the White Lady's husband's remains and then offer them to her in exchange for leaving the town in peace. And at the end of the series, we see Lance and Friday going off to college together and get a little sneak peek of the future of them investigating the paranormal together. So, yeah, again, I kind of forgotten about the time travel aspect, and at first it threw me, but then Ed Brubaker did that nice trick of being like, oh, here's how we explain all the little plot holes I left in volume 1.
Yep.
Here's, her being distracted in the woods. We find out Friday did knock herself out, with a branch in volume 1. The way like, oh, I'm controlling the story from another, angle now as Friday, filling in all the gaps in volume 1. It does get a little exposition-y at times, but I do like that sort of time travel trick that he pulls off here.
Yeah, it's helpful. It's helpful. I didn't mind it because I definitely needed it, and so I was totally okay with it.
I appreciate that the function of time travel as something that has already happened was used, and not that like we're hand waving like, oh, it was all the other timeline, like this is all stuff that has already happened and she's just enacting it. Like, yes, a version of Lance did die, like everything did happen.
Yeah. It's not like retconning what happened, it's just filling in the gaps. Right. And like maybe that's a little like convenient, but I think the way it's handled is really good. And again, I'm really willing to overlook a lot of like minor quibbles with the story and pacing because it's so beautifully drawn. I mean, that's just comics for me in general. Like I can overlook some stuff if I like the way the art looks. And then this time again, as I hinted at, it gets so surreal and like fantastical, but I like Marcos Martin's ability to do both. Like when we get like these visions of these like monsters and paranormal extra dimensional entities and these like bright vibrant colors, it doesn't feel that out of place because the way it's drawn, it's like, oh yeah, that's what that would look like. I don't know, it felt real and surreal at the same time in a really unique way when I read this volume.
Yeah, I feel like this volume changes the genre again, and now we're in like fantasy sci-fi.
Yeah.
But it's still, I mean, like, yes, there are some like, twists that you kind of like pull the rug out from under you a little bit, but at the same time, like, it's not like it's pretty seamless, like in terms of you don't notice, a huge shift, like, oh, suddenly this is a fantasy book. You didn't know what you were reading. Like everything is explained and follows a logical plot.
Yeah, there's a through line there. It doesn't feel like it's just, we got to wrap this up, so we're going to use Deus Ex Machina to kind of like explain everything. There is a through line in the story there, and like it gives the character, I'm blanking on the character's name, but he's the pastor of the church there. He has a few nice moments in this volume. You get I think Lancelot Jones is a character that is always talked about in the first 2 volumes. Here, you actually see him actually doing things. You know what I mean? It's not just a flashback or memories of him. You actually see him be like a protagonist, which is kind of interesting. And as much as like I'm not into like the fairy tale supernatural stuff, I adored the last like 3 or 4 pages of the story when we get them going off to college. And there's a moment where Friday is sort of like daydreaming about, here's the mysteries we're going to solve and the adventures we're going to have, and here's our life's going to be. And she stops herself and says like, I'm not going to think about that. I'm just going to enjoy this moment with my best friend. And they eat some donuts on a train. And it's such a perfect way to end the story. Very human, grounded, natural feeling moment for this story that was so crazy a few pages before.
Yeah. I feel like up until volume 3, Lancelot Jones is like almost this mythical figure. Like we really don't spend a lot of time with him. Like we see him in her flashbacks and when they're younger, and then we see him briefly in volume 1 when he's on a case and he's distracted, and then like that's it. Like everything else that we see from him, it's just her thinking about him. We don't really get to know him as a character until volume 3. So he's almost like just a myth, like he's a story. He's part of the story. He's not really a character himself. But I think that it actually works really well for the reveal where you find out that he's been a changeling all along the entire time that she's known him. And so he was like out of myth basically. But I feel like that kind of goes back and recontextualizes all of that disconnect into a kind of foreshadowing for what happened, for what you discover in volume 3.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it because, Nick, you're talking about like what a strange character he is as a Encyclopedia Brown analog, and what a strange character that is. Like, here's a way of explaining, like, oh yeah, he's kind of strange and seems out of touch because he's not quite human. He's something else. So, like, that kind of adds an explanation that maybe I didn't think I needed, but it does kind of fit by get to the end of the story.
Yeah. I mean, can we talk about what I wanted this book to be? Is that okay? Can we do that?
Sure. I did. Okay, so when I started reading volume 1 originally, like a year ago, I definitely was like, oh my gosh, like there's this huge buildup to get to know Lancelot Jones and he dies at the end of volume 1. Like that's
Right.
super original and unique and an interesting take on this genre. What is this going to turn out to be with only this one character investigating out of this 2-character team? And then like I guess that was volume 2 in a way, but yeah. So go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like I said, like on the show last time, this is a Rorschach blot test for me. Go right ahead. I guess here it is. I kind of wanted Lancelot Jones to be like this really weird, creepy ass dude, like because we talked about like isn't this like revisit? Basically, it's revisiting Encyclopedia Jones and being like, isn't this kind of weird? Isn't this dude kind of snotty and snooty and full of himself and like weirdly like very adult in like his mannerisms and all of this, and isn't that kind of bizarre? And like I was expecting him to like be a serial killer or something like that, and something creepy where we think he's out solving these crimes, but really like he's like some weird vigilante sort of thing. I don't know. And then like you might be thinking, well, then they kill him off, Nick. Well, like what do you do then? What's the point? Well, I was thinking, well, if clearly he must have real enemies then if someone kills him off, and maybe it takes a darker, weirder twist at that point. But yeah, I was expecting more of an exploration and just sort of like Ed Brubaker continuing to punch my childhood nostalgia in the face and be like, just be like, these books you read were just weird. Like what a odd, distorted idea of like crime solving and like I don't know. Something like that, I think I would have also found. And we got some of that, but I think it definitely could have gone darker. That being said, and I wasn't really sure about it going into the book, and certainly finishing the book, I felt this way more. But knowing that this is a YA book, it makes sense that we have some of the reveals we do, that it doesn't go to some of the places I wanted it to go, which like Ed, you don't have to write the things I want. Lord only knows other people don't want those things, and that's fine.
Sure.
But it makes, knowing that this is a YA book, it makes a lot of sense that we don't see some of the other things we see in Ed's other books, namely like really depressing endings where like it's just like some rundown thug outside of a bank that he's just robbed, and he's got like 6 bullet holes in him, and he's just shrugs and thinks of his wife in some dreamscape memory where they're together, and then he dies on the curb.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, this is a good book. Again, feel
book.
free to judge and me as a person that's what I want. But kudos to Ed for not doing that. Also because like 14-year-olds are not gonna, that's not gonna do it for them. So
yeah. I don't know. I feel like when I was reading volume 3, I had the sense of like, oh, this is going places I didn't expect it to and maybe don't like. But again, I think the artwork is enough to make me enjoy it because it is so beautiful at times.
And it's
some of the double
cohesive
page
enough.
spreads.
Yeah. God,
and
the
that
spreads. Oh my God.
Yeah.
Like the one where they're telling the story about like this is, I can't remember any of the fucking names of anything anymore. Like this is this sacred stone in the woods where we sacrifice people,
Yeah.
Empire Craig or whatever it's, I don't know. And like that was cool. I really loved the one where they're telling the story about how this town like may or may not have like played this part in the Revolutionary War, and it's like this very aquatic splash page where you've got like these ships crashing in this storm, and you've got all these fish, and it's just absolutely gorgeous and amazing stuff, and weirdly very dense with text, but because they picked some different, very storybook looking font for those pages, it's very legible. And if they would have used the normal font of that book on those pages, I would have gone absolutely fucking insane. Because it's so thin. It's so thin. So, good typography choices.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And but kind of what leads me back to the discussion I was saying earlier about like the sense of place. And I think like, we're focusing on the main narrative here, but I think the town itself ends up playing a pretty big character, so to speak, in the story. Like these things wouldn't happen in the Midwest. Like it's part of that place of the world that allows these sort of like fantastical things to take place. Like I think Ed is kind of channeling this idea of like there was something here before this town existed. You know what I mean? And that's kind of shaped the town. Again, I don't want to go on a Twin Peaks. I mean, I want to go on a Twin Peaks tangent, but I'll bite my tongue. I won't do it because I read volume 3 of this book. I was like, oh, this is a lot like season 3 of Twin Peaks. And I do not want to spoil anything about season 3 because I know some of us here have not seen it. But there's a sense of like an ancient, not quite evil, but an ancient presence there in this town that is shaping it and changing it. And in this story, we see them, addressing that and fixing it. And there's a part right at the end of the story where they're just like, the rest of the town just kind of like shrugs it off. Like, oh yeah, some weird stuff happened. Do you see like a newspaper where the headline is like local teenager fakes death to solve crime, which is the smallest, shortest Cliff Notes version of the story imaginable, right? But everyone's just like, oh yeah, weird stuff happens here. And a week from now, we'll move on to something else. And like, that is the vibe of the story. And I guess that when that clicked for me, I was like, oh yes, I can roll with the sort of what I think are weird left turn narrative choices, because that's the world that Brubaker and Martin have set up, where things like this just kind of happen. And that kind of was more satisfying to me when I made that connection.
I do wonder if when Lance was basically faking his death that whole week, like when Friday showed up to talk to his dad after a week, like his dad, I mean, he comforted her. Like he was not like crying or distraught or laying in bed for a week like Friday did. So like part of me is like, I want to know if Lance went and told him. Like
Lance's dad is a freaking weird dude too. He's basically Willem Dafoe up in his little tower over the ocean. I mean, being a lighthouse master is not, it's not conducive to your mental health. So I mean,
and he kind of like, he knows his son is a little odd. There's that moment when they're leaving for college and he's like, tells Friday, like, please take care of my son for me. It's like, he's like, it's a touching moment, but it does have some like, some interesting implications when you think about it, given the rest of the relationship in the book. So I don't know. It's a book that, now that we're talking about it, I do want to go back and reread it and kind of refresh my memory. I mean, that one of those really good stories that the ending of the book makes you want to go back and start it again and say, oh yes, I now this is more making sense. And like, maybe I'll get something different out of it going back and rereading it. And again, the first volume, the first day of Christmas, this is the time of year to go back and reread that book. So
yeah. And I do really like this book for that reason. It's definitely one of those books where like Christmas is a part of it, but it's not like everything. And I know the Klaus fans are going to come after me for that, but like it's nice to have Christmas in the background. Again, read into my past Christmas experiences through that as you wish.
yeah.
But yeah, and it's interesting that this was the pick because honestly, the other Christmas book I was going to suggest, which is weirdly Christmas is kind of in the same place and thematically it's very similar, is gosh, it must have been Christmas during that book. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. That I always fucking get this wrong. It's That Texas Blood, volume 3, where the serial killer is.
Yeah.
I mean, am I spoiling this book? There's a dude running around killing people in a snowstorm. Okay.
Yeah.
And
I mean that is the plot of the book. You're not giving away too many details. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, spoilers. That Texas Blood is about people behaving badly. Okay.
Yeah.
But if you're looking for another creepy, scary, but more overtly scary book about Christmas, read that, and you'll always lock your doors again, always, and your windows. Definitely your windows.
Yeah. Nick, you're doing the old like my favorite Christmas movie is Die Hard.
No. I don't want to. No. I don't want to. Oh,
because
my God.
if we're going down that route, my favorite Christmas movie is First Blood, because guess what? That takes place during Christmas, and they never mention it. So
yeah, I just
first Rambo movie is a Christmas movie. So
sure. My Christmas movie is Home Alone. I'm really gonna. No.
Or Goodfellas is actually my favorite Christmas movie, but that's a different conversation. That's for another time. Sorry. I do want to throw this back to Kait very briefly, because I know of the three of us here, you tend to read more young adult YA geared comics, and I know my first glance at this book, it felt that way, but by the end I was like, I don't know if this really is. And that's not a criticism of the book or the genre itself or that type of that book. I'm just curious what your thought of that is. Do you see this as a YA book?
I could see it as an older YA book, yeah. I mean, the only reason that I would say meh is because of the swearing and the smoking, but also those things do occasionally happen in YA, so I don't think that makes this not YA. I did wonder about the smoking though. When she went back in time, I'm like, she's leaving a second trail of cigarette butts around town? Like somebody's gonna figure out that there's two of her here.
I do love that. I was also like, oh man, the smoking in this is out of control. But also, neglect the fact that she, takes an axe to someone's head.
Right.
And we also get a couple very long shots at a burned and desecrated body. So I mean, welcome to America.
So we're doing the content warnings at the very end of the conversation.
Yeah.
So if you made it this far, be warned. No.
This is a Brubaker book. Content warning: violence. It's kind of expected, I think.
Yeah, there's always implied content warning, I guess, with this stuff. But yeah, I thanks for taking time to read this stuff. Again, I was trying to think of, again, a book that is Christmassy without being about Christmas. I think this is a very fun book. We've already raved about the artwork enough, but I'll do it one more time. It is a beautiful looking book. I like the sort of small digest sized, collections that they did for it. I would love to see an oversized hardcover collection at some point down the road. I will buy it again if that's the case. Before we wrap it up here, no pun intended, given the theme of presents at Christmas. do you have any final thoughts about this book? Would you recommend it to someone to read this time of year?
I think so, yeah. As long as they're not looking for something that's like cheery and uplifting. You know?
Sure.
Not that this does end happy, I guess, but yeah.
Yeah, I would recommend it. It's definitely hard to sort of give people the whole width and breadth of like what they're getting into, because honestly you can't and probably shouldn't, given that those things are, you know, very twisty and revelatory. But I think if you've got a reader who just has an open mind and is willing to sort of roll with the punches, I think this would be a good read. And Kate's right. Like, it feels like it very weirdly skirts the YA line to some extent. So I guess what I'm saying there is, like, if someone is out there asking, like, is this okay for my kid? I mean, I don't know. I think we've probably covered most of the things you're gonna see in this book. So just take that into consideration, because I don't think this nicely falls into the YA bucket. I don't think it does. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but it's something you need to know, because I have seen a couple reviewers out there who just stamp it with the YA label pretty easily and quickly.
Right. Just because there's a teenager in it, it's a young adult book. And
yeah,
again, I
there's
think,
people
like,
growing
it's
up. Who
1973,
fucking cares?
people
It's
smoked
YA.
back then. You know, if yeah. Yeah, and if you watch any movies from the same time, you're going to see smoking. So yeah, it's a PG, it's a 73 PG movie.
Yeah.
So I have to
smoking is cool.
So,
who cares?
Yeah. I mean, it looks pretty cool. I hate to say it looked pretty cool.
Look, I don't do it. I've never done it, but I look at these pictures and these people seem pretty confident and pretty happy with themselves. So, I mean...
I will say I really love this book. I'm glad I finally took the time to read the volume 3. I kind of read it quickly to do this conversation, so I am planning on going back and rereading all 3 volumes at some point over the winter, just to get that vibe. It does hit some good Twin Peaks notes for me, which of course is always a plus. So thanks again for taking the time to read it. And I hope you both have a very happy holiday season. And of course, say the same to all the listeners. Thanks for listening. Thank you to Nick and Kate for joining me for this conversation. Thank you to Zach for proof listing. Thank you for listening to the show. And until next time, comics are good, and so are you.